All right. Well, we're getting a few people coming in now. So I think we should probably get started. I'm going to welcome everybody. Um, at the moment, we have a few of us on the screen. SOS executives. My name's Andy. We've got Mark, and we've got Mark as our president. We've got Tess. Tess is our genius. She's a resident genius. Yes, she is. And you can see Mike. Mike is the president of the Victorian chapter of the Australian Climbing Association. Mike has been working very hard in Victoria to try and reverse and stop some of the closures down there. And he's going to give us a brief, let us know what's going on down there and what he's been up to try and stop it. And
I might, Andy, I just jumped in quickly to say what this series is about. So SOS are running what we're calling Access Australia. So this is going to be a series of online presentations getting to the root causes of these access closures across the country. So we've seen over the last 4 years, 5 years or so, closures affecting things like you wouldn't think, say, the Lake Tyrrell Rally would be closed, for instance. You wouldn't have thought that Mount Warning would be closed or the Glasshouse Mountains would be under threat. So over the next 6 months or so, we're going to do a series of these presentations, just a fairly brief rundown and try and get to the core of the issue and just to provide the recreational people who really enjoy these places a bit more information about what's going on. So that's the purpose of this series of talks. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Andy.
all right, I'm going to hand over to Mike, but firstly, I'll just mention we will be taking questions. Mike's going to give his brief and questions. You'll have a little Q&A box down there. If you type your questions, if we don't get a lot of people coming on, I may ask you to join as a panelist, and you can ask it with your video on. But right now, let's just hand over to Mike, and we will see how we go.
Thank you, Andy. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Tomkins. I am the president of the Australian Climbing Association Victoria. We formed this association in 2019 in response to the Grampians climbing bands, which at that stage were the world's largest climbing bands by far. That's now been overtaken by two further world's largest climbing bands. The Grampians was further banned to almost 80% climbing gone in 2022. So that is now the official title holder of the world's largest climbing band. In second place now is Arapiles, which on the 4th of November this year, just 6 weeks ago, was banned to approximately 63% of climbing banned. And this extraordinary situation is unprecedented throughout the world. So that's a little bit of a background to why we formed an association. And we formed it off the back of a similar association in Queensland, the Australian Climbing Association of Queensland, which has been active for about 15 years. And we just copied all of their systems and pretty much their constitution and took advice from people in Queensland who knew what they were doing. For some context to start with on Arapiles, it's 4 hours to the west of Melbourne, pretty much halfway between Melbourne and Adelaide, in the middle of nowhere in wheat fields. It's a beautiful rock that sticks out of the plain. It looks a bit like a broken version of Ayers Rock, Uluru. And that brokenness makes it actually wonderful to climb because it's covered in handholds and footholds and placements for climbing gear. It's got wonderful climbs. More than 3,000 registered rock climbs there, all recorded in guidebooks, and has been climbed on since the 1960s, predominantly using natural protection. Very few bolts there. It's probably 99% approximately natural protection with a few bolts where required. A lot of the bolts that have been placed there are actually at the top of climbs to allow a means to easily get off the climbs by rappelling down rather than scrambling down gullies. So it's kind of an environmental initiative to place a couple of bolts as an anchor so you can get back down to the ground in the easiest and cleanest way possible. Yeah, a little bit of history of recent events. So at Arapiles in 2020, large sections of Arapiles were placed under voluntary restrictions following the initial shock of the Grampians bans. So we knew it was going to spread. About 12% of the climbs were banned in some form in 2020, including the main central section of Arapiles called Tiger Wall. So that was in 2020, and the signs at the time said, we'd prefer you don't come in here. It was that sort of voluntary exclusion. That was respected. Everybody thought we've got to be very careful here. Arapiles is so precious to people all over the world that we don't want to harm that in any way, because the local land council needs to have time, which is what they asked for on the signs. They wanted time to review what they found there in terms of cultural heritage. And that was respected by the local community. A little bit more context as well. There is a very strong local community at Arapiles in the form of a town of about 500, 600 people called Natamuk, which you've probably heard about during the last few weeks of this media storm that's happened as a result of the banning of Arapiles. And Natamuk is, it's pretty much a climbers town. About half of the people that live there are climbers, and the reason they live out there in the middle of nowhere between Adelaide and Melbourne, right in the wheat fields where there's nothing else much to do really. That town is going to completely decline. There's also some serious concerns over what's going to happen to professionals in the area, because the nearest larger sized town is Horsham. It's quite a large, town with a lot of services there, health services and all sorts of professional services. And a good proportion of the professionals in Horsham would be local climbers. And with the loss of the Grampians and now potentially the loss of Arapiles, that's the reason for the furore that's happened. And you'll have seen a lot of media about this in the mainstream media. There's been a lot of politics in the Victorian Parliament. There's been a lot of politics. Also, we've taken it to Canberra, to a federal level. And all sorts of people are now realizing, oh my God, what have we done? We've banned Arapiles. We were going along on a roll of, oh, well, it's the Grampians. Oh, well, it's this. Oh, well, it's that. But now it's Arapiles. Everybody has sat up, taken notice and thought, yeah, this doesn't pass the pub test. It's not going to fly. And we knew this would happen 5 years ago because of the nature of the different climbing areas. Arapiles is the jewel in the crown of Australian climbing. And to ban it so comprehensively under the circumstances that it has been banned, it's not going to fly. So the good news is it's not going to fly. The interesting part now is, how is that going to play out? So I've done a little bit of history on Arapiles, some present. Obviously, there's a bit of political interest here, state and federal. The media's got involved. And later on, I'll tell you a little bit about campaigning as well, and what we've been doing, and what will certainly be the same kind of experiences you'll be having in Save Our Summits, to face the same issues. And some of them are quite robust issues to tackle, because there's strong feelings about this kind of thing. And what I'm getting at really is the whole connection with Aboriginal cultural heritage, which is the reason for all this. There's a lot of talk about other drivers, such as financial drivers, or always follow the money. Some people think there are mining and quarrying interests that could come into play. There's all sorts of theories that people have about, generally, the government wanting us to not enjoy the outdoors, to keep us in cities or whatever. But just pushing all that aside, as it doesn't matter if those things are true or they're not true. We've got this situation with the local land councils, Parks Victoria, and the Victorian government. So this 6-week sustained media event that's been running, what's actually happened? Well, this is probably good news, but there have been 7 sackings so far of senior figures involved in this event, what's been going on. And it's in my view that those people have lost their jobs or will soon be losing their jobs, primarily because the Labour government in Melbourne has got involved, and they thought, we can't be having this. But, you know, it's embarrassing. It's politically threatening. The leader of the Labour government, Jacinta Allen in Melbourne, is looking a little bit shaky on various grounds at the moment. Financial and general political. She took over from Daniel Andrews, and she's inherited a lot of these difficulties from the hangover from his tenure. I think it was 11 years as Premier of a Labour government. So those 7 sackings, well, the first one was the CEO of Parks Victoria. So that indicates very, very strongly that something has gone wrong inside our park manager. And that makes me very happy, because I've been saying that for five and a half years. Something has gone very wrong if our park manager, the government agency that we employ to manage our parks, is doing its damnedest to keep people out of their park. Well, it's not their park. It's everybody's park. And that's the sort of difficulty it comes down to. So I guess a lot of people involved in SOS are from New South Wales and Queensland, and are probably not too familiar or as familiar with politics in Victoria and Melbourne. But obviously it's dominated by the city and dominated by the inner city, where most people who are voting would not generally know much about Arapalis or the Grampians, or care too much about what happens in the country. It's a very urbanized state in that regard. You know, a huge proportion of the voters are inner city or suburban, and they are easily led to ignore the things that would be happening in national parks and state forests and everything like that. So, yeah, CEO of Parks Victoria was sacked. It was a rather abrupt affair, and it happened immediately after an MP in the upper house in Victoria named David Limbrick put in a documents motion requesting all the documents pertaining to the Grampians and Arapalis rock climbing, both environmental and cultural heritage, with particular reference to the Grampians Peaks Trail. That documents motion went into the Victorian government without them really realizing that the danger it would cause, and the Labour government allowed this documents motion to be passed on the floor of the upper house. Within the next 24 hours, phone calls were made, and the Parks Victoria CEO was sacked. Those are the facts of the matter. Those 2 events may not be connected, but the documents motion text was put together by ACAV because we know what happened with the Grampians Peaks Trail, the Grampians climbing bans, the environmental reports, the cultural heritage reports, and also the Arapalis reports, environmental and cultural heritage. We know what's been going on. It's all over the Victorian channels, both the ACAV website and a very good resource called Save Grampians Climbing, which is an independent group that puts together comprehensive news stories with all the details and all the links. If you ever want to see what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years in Victoria, just go to Save Grampians Climbing, and there's an incredible history there, which has been very valuable to us because we're able to share those links with politicians and the media. So soon after the Parks Victoria CEO was fired, there's a board that sits above the director level. So there's the CEO and the board of directors of Parks Victoria, who are full-time employees, day-to-day manage the park service in Victoria. There's a board that sits above that a part-time role. So there's a chairman and a steering board above that. And that's comprised of 5 members at the moment, chaired by a man called John Pandazopoulos, who's a former Labour MP, and he oversees the whole thing, and they put out a quarterly report on the state of parks in Victoria. And those 5 people were all put on notice that they're going to terminate in March 2025. So those 5 people are effectively fired as well. So the top 6 people in the management of Parks Victoria, gone. The circumstances of that are quite extraordinary. But what happened was the Environment Minister, who Parks Victoria sit under, in that he's the Minister for Environment and Tourism and various events like that. He's got 3 portfolios associated with what we do, rock climbing, and he was not happy. When that documents motion came up and the news came out that, oh, it's passed, and those documents are going to reveal all the dirty laundry on what's happened for the last 6 years by Parks Victoria. Yep, all those people were fired very quickly. What did they do? Why is that political dynamite? The truth is we don't know, because we've been doing freedom of information requests for the last 5 years, but they arrive very late. We have to argue very hard to get information out of the government under the Freedom of Information Act. And when we get them, most of the text is blacked out. So we're piecing together snippets of information. But what we suspect happened is the long distance footpath through the Grampians that was constructed in the early 2020s went through some very sensitive landscape, which both environmentally and from a cultural heritage perspective, right where all the climbing that's been banned has gone. And Parks Victoria wanted this footpath to go ahead. It was a long-standing political plan, dream. It had been master planned for a long time with all this, it's a 160 kilometer trail, which walks down the full spine of the Grampians National Park. Wonderful thing to do. Great, lovely to have. There's various trails like that around Australia. It's a 13-day walk for most people. That's the normal plan. So you have to camp 12 times on the way. And the way it's been organized is that they've created campsites all along the way, which are very much, very few facilities there. They've just created wooden platforms and provided water tanks. That's pretty much it. There's nothing much else. But you have to pay for the camping. The walking is free, but you pay for the camping. And fundamentally, there seems to be a plan in which Parks Victoria wants people to walk on that trail and nowhere else. And the trail required 90 kilometers of cutting of new track through virgin bushland and across rocky cliffs and all sorts of places. And that was a line on a map. It was quite simply a GPS brain fart. We will go along this track and we will cut this trail. How did they get that through the various indigenous groups that had an interest in that area? We suspect that climbers were used as a cultural offset. And we suspect very strongly that the reports that will be produced under this documents motion will demonstrate that. That's shocking to consider that that may have happened under the auspices of a park manager who in the past was a benevolent group. You know, we used to have cups of tea with the rangers and help them chainsaw trees out of the way. How did they turn into something that could do nefarious things like that to let's get climbers out of the park? The reason is there are two pieces of legislation that have driven this rather unpleasant situation. The first is the Parks Victoria Act of 2018. It was a new Act of Parliament that was introduced in late 2018, and by early 2019, we were hit with the world's largest climbing bans. What did that act do? It gave Parks Victoria a large degree of autonomy from the minister responsible. So the minister was able to deflect any questions he got, any awkward questions about what's going on in the Grampians. He just passed it to Parks Victoria, and Parks Victoria was able to answer with bureaucratic nonsense. So we've unfortunately had an act which has given the CEO of Parks Victoria the keys to almost a quarter of the state to do with as his private fiefdom. And he has done that, but now he's lost his job. The second piece of legislation is the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act 2006, which gives enormous freedom to Indigenous groups to use clauses within that act to advance the interests of their corporations. And the Indigenous land councils are corporations. They have balance sheets, which you can find online, and you can see how much money's flowing through them. And it's their interest and intent, as any good corporation should, to maximize what they do under the law to improve their profitability. There are some limits on that. They are supposedly not for profits, but they employ more and more and more people and purchase more and more and more vehicles and increase their leverage in everything that they can achieve to advance their cause as an Indigenous land council. Perfectly natural, perfectly normal. Again, Parks Victoria, perfectly natural, perfectly normal, looking after the interests of their entity. But those two acts of Parliament give us enormous difficulties because what we've arrived at is the world's largest climbing bans, 1, 2, and 3. This Arapalis ban that's in place at the moment is completely unworkable because it's going to damage so much for so many people. So we're going to do some QA pretty soon, but I'd just like to touch upon a few things before I close in regard to campaigning. What have we been doing in campaigning? And it's very similar to what you've been doing in SOS for campaigning. We've engaged the media as much as we can. We've had a great deal of help from certain journalists in the media, particularly in the Australian newspaper, but also the Herald Sun, which is a Victorian paper, and very strong on supporting what we do. Now, all of that media really is, you would call the opposition in a political sense, so they're not on the Labour Greens side of things, and that's given us a great deal of difficulty with the climbing community because a lot of people are naturally environmentalists, Greens voters, and Labour voters, and they are annoyed when we engage with politicians that are not their preferred stripe. So that does give us some difficulty. We've had great success also in politics with we've got 3 politicians, one Liberal, one National, and one Libertarian, who have been absolutely solid behind the climbers for 5.5 years. And lots of other politicians have now shown their support since the Arapalis ban has come in. No politicians on the Labour and Green side and on the left side of politics have shown any interest at all, and we've been fobbed off every step of the way. So we get open to accusations of, being right wing or whatever, but we're just engaging with the opposition. If the left wing was in opposition, we'd engage with that side, because the opposition are the ones who listen in these circumstances. So just to close the main presentation here, I'd just like to move to the final step for campaigning. When everything fails, when you've tried everything, which we have for 5.5 years, and the politicians are on your side and the media is on your side, and maybe the climbers are not so much on your side because they don't like the politics, we get down to what can only be described as civil disobedience. Because otherwise, how are you ever going to access the outdoors? And unfortunately, things have had to go that far. But I rather think of it as not so much civil disobedience as civil nonchalance, really. You just do what you think is right yourself, and don't worry about any other entity coming along and saying you can't do what you're doing, because all you're doing is interacting in the wilderness, in the middle of nowhere. There's nobody about. Nobody can police you out there. You do what you do. And just to that end, I'll close with a pretty bulletproof comment by a bulletproof person. Well, actually, no, it wasn't bulletproof, but Martin Luther King Jr., who said during his civil rights campaign in the 60s, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. It's not just a revolutionary act. It's not. It's just a responsibility. If you don't go and climb mountains, climb rocks, go out into the outdoors, you're letting the team down, because you really are allowing yourself to be contained in an urban environment. That can't be right. So Martin Luther King had this down in the 60s. We've got to follow him. That's me, Andy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was very, very good. All right, we have a couple of questions. David Barton has been in the question chat. He has a lot to say. I can't put you on video, David, but your microphone, if you mute your microphone, you'll be able to talk to us. Go for your life.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Some people will have read quite a bit of the stuff that I've written about these issues in a wider sense. A lot of it's available on my website, bartonbriefing.com.au, just a bit of a plug there. But it seems to me, so a lot of stuff that I've written about this, but it seems to me that the Victorian government, as a part of their new treaty process, intends to hand over the ownership of and control of most, if not all, public land to what are in essence, as Mike said, private Aboriginal corporations, which benefit only their members. This has already happened, as you would be aware, with so many national parks and reserves across Victoria. What approach do you think we can take to ensure that this does not happen, that all this public land gets handed over to these private Aboriginal corporations?
I think, thanks for that question, David. And I have read your work on this, and I really appreciate everything you've been doing. And I think you're right on the money with all of that stuff. What can we do to resolve this? It has to be resolved at a political level and a legislation level. So I mentioned those two particular acts, the Parks Victoria Act 2018 and the Aboriginal Heritage Act 2006, are of particular difficulty to us in Victoria. What we've also done, though, we had an ACAV contingent go to Canberra recently and take this up at federal level so we can get pressure from the federal government. And we've had great engagement with Jacinta Price and other persons interested in this field. And Jacinta Price did put a motion up in the federal Senate, which only just lost 25 to 28, to have a review of Aboriginal heritage legislation nationwide. So that was a very strong indication that that's going to happen soon, even though that vote was lost it was a close run thing. Two people flipping on that would have caused a full review of all Aboriginal heritage legislation nationwide. So there is a big shift happening politically on that. And we're hoping that pressure from Canberra will filter down onto the Labor government in Victoria. And yeah, the bottom line is we expect the Arapalis bans to be reversed either by the present Labor government during 2025, and failing that, by a new government that comes in Victoria in late 2026. So it's either going to happen within, say, 6 months or 2 years. The Liberals and Nationals in Victoria have committed in writing to reverse the Arapalis bans. No beating about the bush. They have said they will reverse the Arapalis bans, which means taking to task what's been happening within those Indigenous corporations to balance that. You know, everybody knows that there's changes happening in that space, but it's completely out of balance at the moment with small corporations able to restrict everybody from public space. It makes no sense, and it's not going to fly.
That was, yeah, okay. So you really do think that they will? I mean, what's the chance of them getting in and making that happen? I mean, the sentiment in Victoria has definitely across the country has been changing in that regard. So I guess the chances of a change of government is pretty likely.
Well, I'm thinking the momentum is such at the moment. We're having a bit of a lull over Christmas now. We've got, we had a 6-week news cycle where the government has been on the back foot. I didn't really mention what the 7th sacking was, but there was a spat between the chairman of the local land council at Arapalis and the Premier, Jacinta Allen. And he wrote a scathing letter to the Premier, which no one has seen. And he said, we will not consult with the climbers. The climbers are they said a disparaging name about us, but it was something like crazy wild-eyed activists or something like that. They said the climbers were just punks, basically. And the Premier leaked that letter to the Herald Sun. And the Herald Sun called me, and we had a bit of toing and froing, bouncing between the Herald Sun and the Premier's office. And the story that came out was quite devastating. It was the Premier saying, well, I'm the Premier. You're not going to win. If you want to take out the Queen, you've got to make sure you take her out. And you can't do that as a chairman of the local land council. So he lost his job, and we now have a new chairman of the local land council. So this gives me some indication that the Labor government in Victoria, can smell the blood in the water and wants to change this, and they might reverse the Arapalis bans before they're reversed for them, and they might alter those 2 items of legislation before the opposition comes in and reverses them for them. So there is some hope for that. Yeah.
And that'll cause a snowball reaction across the other states with any luck.
Well, it did happen in Western Australia. There was a similar thing happening in WA where the legislation was completely unbalanced, and some serious events happened where, life couldn't go on. Farmers couldn't farm, or I think there was some various problems with.
Well, that was the digging. They couldn't dig with 30 centimeters under the,
That's right. Practicality goes out of the window over these ideologies, and it was reversed overnight. I don't know how they did that, but I didn't look into the detail. But WA, came back from the brink. So we need to make Arapalis the Ayers Rock Uluru of Southeast Australia to bring this back from the brink, and reverse all these crazy policies that have been happening in Victoria.
100%. Go for it, Mark.
Thanks for that synopsis of the current state of affairs down in Victoria, Mike. There's so many parallels with other closures around the country. You talked about the problems with FOIs, for instance. At the moment, SOS have got a long-running FOI request in with the Queensland government. So I submitted this back in January, and we still have not got anything from them at all. And they've promised something apparently before Christmas, but it's just the whole machinery of government seemingly collaborating to make things hard for people to get information about what's going on. The other parallel was just the Aboriginal heritage legislation in Victoria, very similar to what's present in New South Wales. The discussion about handing over all the national parks in New South Wales. So that's the long-term goal at the moment for the National Parks and Wildlife Service in New South Wales. So they're just so many parallels with what's going on. So much misinformation coming from government. I was thinking for a while that Mount Warning in New South Wales may, be the trigger that causes things to change, but we're still stuck in limbo. Mount Warning will now be closed for over 5 years, coming up in March 2025. And it just seems like the climbing community in Victoria have really woken up to the fact that, what's happening at Arapiles is just so fundamentally wrong. And it's just so great to see a lot of people getting off their seats and finally realising that they've got to do something about it. Similarly, in New South Wales, we still need that rush of community support to try and, put more political pressure on the government to get Mount Warning reopened, And that's the key thing, I think, in making the government realise that there's votes in this, and if they don't reopen it up, there's a chance that they may lose government. So that's one of the key things. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you, Mark. Just to pick up on a few of those points, the freedom of information system seems to be completely broken. I've been involved with some of the political parties, opposition parties in Victoria, and even the MPs can't get information. They get redacted as well, which is outrageous. There should be parliamentary privilege, but even the opposition doesn't get to see what the incumbent government is doing. Crazy stuff. Yes, all national parks are at risk, and I think New South Wales has been more blatant than any other state in announcing that. There's a website out there, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Mark, which clearly states a plan over the next 15 to 20 years to hand over the freeholds of all New South Wales national parks to the local Indigenous group. It does have a caveat in there that they don't know who those groups are yet in the majority of cases. So they've got to work out who they give the parks back to. You can imagine how that's going to play out. Well, it's mine. Yeah, I saw it first. It's mine.
Absolutely. There's so many competing interests from different Aboriginal corporations, some of them with very remote connections to these places as well. You've got a lot of metropolitan land councils that'll put their hands up to claim bits of land in distant parts of the state.
Yeah.
So it's just a recipe for disaster. And at the end of the day, our point is that, public land belongs in public hands, and that's where it should remain. And it doesn't matter, there's you get a lot of anger in the community when you've got plans in place to put some sort of private resort in a national park, for instance. But what they're doing, handing over freehold to Aboriginal corporations, is exactly the same. And people should be getting really angry about what's coming up.
These are protected parks. The reason for national parks is to preserve them and to present them to the public for recreation. Absolutely. They're not to be sold off or given away or any of that nonsense. We must not let that happen at all, because it opens it up into commercial situation, and you've sold off public land. Really, it's selling the family silver, which it can then be, anything can be done with it. I did think, actually, Mark, that 6 months ago, I thought Mount Warning would be the place where this starts to tip and we start to reverse the tide, because you've got a lot of support up there, and it's a better situation in many ways than rock climbing, which people think rock climbers are insane for hanging off cliffs by their fingernails. Why do you do it? It's not safe, etc. And maybe Mount Warning is a more iconic looking thing to do, and I thought that might flip earlier, but it looks now like Arapiles is going to do the job.
I'll just wrap up our conversation now. Thanks again, Mike Tomkins. Thanks, Andy Flanagan, for organising this. Thanks, Tessa and other people for joining us. This will be available as a video through our website, the SOS website. So that's saveoursummits.org. Make sure you look up the websites that Mike mentioned. Do you want to mention them again, Mike, just quickly?
SaveGrampiansClimbing.org. Yep.
And there's the ACAV website and Facebook page. So make sure you follow those social links. The Save Grampians climbing site, I've looked at it constantly over the last 4 years, and the level of detail in some of those articles is absolutely outstanding. And perhaps something that could be published as a book down the track, you know, when we win this thing. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you if you're joining us at a later date on video. We'll be doing more of these webinar type things over the next 6 months or so, focusing on other parts of the country that are being closed off for similar reasons to the issues that Mike raised for the Arapalis and the Grampians. And the more people know about this, the more people get upset about it, the better chance we have that we can overturn these ridiculous bans and get access back to our national parks, restore our wonderful summits, our crags, all these places where people really go to refresh and re-energize and get in touch with the natural world, because we really need to get out there and save these places for our children and their children. So thanks for joining us, Mike. Thanks, Andy. And thanks again, Tessa, and everyone else who joined us tonight.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, see ya.